In October 1944, somewhere in the North Atlantic, a United States Navy destroyer escort was dying. The USS Mason had sailed directly into what would later be called the storm of the century, escorting a convoy of slow-moving tugs and barges through mountainous seas and hurricane-force winds. Now, after hours of punishment that would have broken most ships, the Mason's deck had split open. The seam holding the ship together had fractured. Two beams in the engine compartment had collapsed. Water was flooding below. The radio antenna had been torn away by the wind leaving the ship, unable to call for help. A 70-degree roll far beyond what any destroyer escort was designed to survive had nearly capsized them. By every reasonable calculation, the Mason should have turned for port, sought shelter, and let the British escorts handle the rest of the convoy. Instead, after making temporary repairs at sea in conditions that made working on deck nearly suicidal, the Mason turned back into the storm. They had 12 more ships to save. This was the moment that defined the USS Mason and her crew, not because of what they accomplished, though that was extraordinary, but because of what it meant. The Mason was an experiment nicknamed Eleanor's Folly by skeptics who believed it would fail. Her crew of 160 African-American enlisted men had been given this ship to prove something that should never have required proof that black sailors could operate a complex warship as competently as white sailors. When the deck split and the storm raged and every instinct screamed to seek safety, these men chose to go back. Not because they were fearless, they were terrified, but because they knew their failure would be used to justify continued discrimination, and their success might open doors for generations to come. This is the story of the USS Mason, a ship that fought two wars simultaneously, one against German U-boats and one against the racism of the nation she served. To understand the significance of the USS Mason, we must first understand what the United States Navy was like for black Americans in 1941. The answer is simple and brutal: the Navy did not want them. While the Army had maintained black units since the Civil War, the Navy had systematically excluded African Americans from virtually all roles, except the most menial. In the early years of World War II, black men in the Navy were restricted to serving as messmen stewards who cooked, cleaned, and waited on white officers. They could not train for technical ratings. They could not operate weapons. They could not advance through the ranks to positions of real authority or responsibility. The official justification was that close quarters aboard ships required racial harmony, which Navy leadership claimed could only be achieved through segregation and the exclusion of black sailors from combat roles. The real reason was simpler. The Navy's officer corps, drawn heavily from Southern states and Naval Academy traditions, did not believe black men were capable of operating complex machinery or functioning effectively in combat. When pressed on this policy, senior Navy officials would point to a lack of qualified black candidates while simultaneously ensuring that black men were denied the training that would qualify them. This began to change slowly and grudgingly only because of external pressure. In December 1941, immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People wrote to President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanding that African Americans be allowed to serve in combat roles across all branches of the military. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, had been a vocal advocate for civil rights and used her considerable influence to push for change within the Navy. The timing was significant. America had just entered a global war against fascism and racial ideology, yet its own military remained deeply segregated. The contradiction was glaring, and civil rights organizations intended to exploit it. By mid-1942, facing mounting pressure and desperate need for manpower, as the war expanded, the Navy agreed to begin accepting black men for general service ratings positions other than messmen. The catch was that this would be done on an experimental basis in segregated units, with the expectation that the experiment would likely fail and justify a return to the old system. The training facility for these new black sailors was established at Camp Robert Smalls, a segregated section of the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois. The name itself was significant. Robert Smalls had been an enslaved man who, during the Civil War, commandeered a Confederate transport ship and delivered it to Union forces, eventually becoming a ship's pilot and serving with distinction. Now, nearly 80 years later, a training camp bearing his name was preparing a new generation of black sailors to prove themselves in war. The men who trained at Camp Robert Smalls knew they were not simply learning to be sailors. They were being tested. Every mistake would be magnified. Every failure would be attributed to their race. Every success would have to be undeniable. The pressure was immense, and it began from the moment they arrived. Segregation at Great Lakes was absolute. Black recruits lived in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and trained in separate facilities. White officers supervised their training, and those officers held the full range of attitudes. Some were genuinely committed to the success of the program, others were openly skeptical, and a few were hostile. The recruits endured it all because they understood what was at stake. By late 1943, the Navy had trained enough black sailors to crew 2 ships. The first was USS PC-1264, a submarine chaser assigned to coastal patrol duties. The second would be something more ambitious, a destroyer escort assigned to convoy duty in the Atlantic. This ship would be named after Ensign Newton Henry Mason, a black naval aviator who had been killed in action at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. Newton Mason's story was itself remarkable. Born in New York City on Christmas Eve 1918, he had enlisted in the Naval Reserve in November 1940 and been appointed an aviation cadet, one of the very few black men to become a Navy pilot before the war. Assigned to Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the carrier USS Saratoga, he flew a Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter. When the Saratoga was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in January 1942, Mason's squadron was reassigned to shore duty in Hawaii, but Mason himself was transferred to Fighting Squadron 2. On May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first major naval engagement where surface ships never sighted each other, fought entirely by carrier aircraft, Ensign Mason's Wildcat disappeared during combat with Japanese Zero fighters. He was 23 years old. He was declared missing in action and posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. When the Navy decided to name a ship after him, it was both a tribute to his sacrifice and a statement about the new experiment in racial integration. A ship named for a black hero would be crewed primarily by black sailors. The symbolism was deliberate. The keel of USS Mason was laid at the Boston Navy Yard on October 14, 1943. She was an Evarts-class destroyer escort, a relatively new type of warship designed specifically for convoy protection. Destroyer escorts were smaller and less heavily armed than fleet destroyers, but they were perfect for anti-submarine warfare. They had the speed to chase down U-boats, the sonar and depth charges to attack them, and the endurance to accompany convoys across the Atlantic. They were also cheap and fast to build, which mattered greatly in 1943, when German U-boats were still sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. The Mason was launched on November 17, 1943, with Ensign Mason's mother, Mrs. David Mason, serving as sponsor. The ship was commissioned on March 20, 1944, just under 2 years after her namesake's death. The crew of the USS Mason consisted of approximately 204 men. Of these, 160 were black enlisted sailors who had trained at Camp Robert Smalls. The remaining personnel were officers and a few specialized ratings, all of whom were white. This reflected Navy policy. While black men could now serve in general ratings, they still could not be commissioned as officers, except in rare cases. Command of the Mason was given to Lieutenant Commander William M. Blackford, a white officer from Virginia. Blackford's assignment was itself noteworthy. He was the great-grandson of Mary Barclay Minor Blackford, a prominent abolitionist who had worked to end slavery. Whether Blackford was selected for this reason or simply happened to be available is unclear, but the historical irony was not lost on anyone. The crew came to call him Big Bill, and by all accounts, he was a fair commanding officer who judged his men by their performance, not their skin color. He would need to be, because the ship he commanded was being watched by everyone in the Navy, with an interest in whether this experiment would succeed or fail. From the moment the Mason was commissioned, she operated under a microscope. Officers at Navy headquarters tracked her progress. Reports on crew performance were filed and scrutinized. Any incident, any failure, any suggestion that the ship was not operating at peak efficiency would be seized upon as evidence that black sailors could not handle combat duty. The crew understood this perfectly. One sailor later recalled the constant sense that they were not just serving their country, but representing their entire race. "We knew we couldn't afford to fail," Charles Divers, one of the crewmen, said years later. "We were called Eleanor's Folly, an experiment designed to fail. When we did so well rather than eat crow, the Navy downplayed all our accomplishments. The nickname stung because it was meant to. It implied that the ship existed only because of Eleanor Roosevelt's advocacy, and that without her political influence, the Navy would never have allowed such an experiment. It suggested that the Mason was a vanity project, not a real warship. The crew's response was to prove the skeptics wrong through performance. Following shakedown training off Bermuda, the Mason departed Charleston, South Carolina on June 14, 1944, escorting convoy CK-3 bound for England. This was 8 days after D-Day, and the Atlantic was still dangerous. German U-boats, though increasingly hunted and depleted, remained a serious threat. The Mason's role was to screen the convoy to patrol around the merchant ships, use sonar to detect submarines and attack any U-boat that attempted to approach. The crossing was uneventful, which was exactly what successful convoy escort looked like. On July 6th, the Mason arrived at Horta in the Azores, then continued to Belfast, Northern Ireland. It was in Belfast that the crew of the Mason had an experience that many would remember for the rest of their lives. Northern Ireland had been at war since 1939, had suffered through German bombing raids, and had welcomed more than 300,000 American servicemen and women. When the black sailors of the Mason came ashore, they expected the same segregation and discrimination they faced at home. Instead, they found warmth and acceptance. Local families invited them to their homes. Pubs welcomed them without hesitation. Young women danced with them at social events. For men who had grown up under Jim Crow laws and experienced daily racism even in the Navy, this was revelatory. "The Irish treated us like human beings," one sailor recalled. "They didn't care about the colour of our skin. They saw the uniform and respected us for wearing it." The contrast became even sharper when the Mason reached England. After Belfast, the ship sailed to Plymouth, and from there some crew members travelled to London on Liberty. They had heard about a USO canteen that served hot dogs, mustard and Coca-Cola, simple American pleasures they had not tasted in months. When they arrived exhausted and eager, a white woman at the door informed them that this was not their canteen. The USO had segregated facilities. Black servicemen were not welcome. "We had travelled all this way only to find that Jim Crow was there before us," recalled James Dufault, one of the sailors. Another crewman, Gordon Grant, confronted the woman. "I asked her why. She told me it was the way the US wanted it and the US paid the bills. But this is your country," I told her. "You could take a stand." She did not. The men left angry and humiliated. They had crossed the Atlantic protecting ships and cargo bound for the European war effort. They were serving their country in combat. And still in an American facility on British soil, they were treated as second-class citizens because of their skin colour. The experience hardened something in them, a determination to prove their worth so thoroughly that denial would become impossible. That opportunity came in September 1944. On September 19th, the Mason departed New York as part of the escort screen for convoy NY-119. This was not a typical convoy. Instead of fast merchant ships carrying war materials, NY-119 consisted of seagoing tugs, harbour tugs, yard tankers, and barges, some of the slowest vessels afloat. These were being sent to England to help build piers and support facilities for continued operations following the Normandy invasion. The convoy's average speed was below 5 knots, roughly the pace of a brisk walk. This meant the crossing would take 4 weeks or more. an agonizingly long exposure to potential U-boat attack. It also meant the convoy would be particularly vulnerable to weather. Fast ships can outrun storms or power through them. Slow ships must endure whatever the ocean brings. What the ocean brought in October 1944 was catastrophic. The Mason and convoy NY 1-19 sailed directly into what meteorologists would later call one of the worst North Atlantic storms of the century. Hurricane-force winds created waves 40 feet high and higher. The sky was dark continuously day and night. Visibility was measured in yards. The slow-moving vessels of the convoy designed for harbour and coastal work were being hammered by open ocean conditions they were never meant to face. Ships began to break formation, unable to maintain course and speed in the mountainous seas. Some started taking on water, others lost steering. The convoy was disintegrating, and if the ships scattered too widely, they would be impossible to protect from submarines. The Mason, despite being a small ship herself, was ordered to escort the most vulnerable vessels to safety. This required extraordinary seamanship. Lieutenant Commander Blackford had to maneuver his ship through seas that were throwing the Mason around like a toy, maintain visual contact with ships that kept disappearing in wave troughs, and somehow keep his own vessel intact while doing it. The crew worked around the clock. Men who were off duty could not sleep because the ship's movement was too violent. Those on duty clung to whatever they could grab to avoid being thrown across compartments or overboard. On October 18th, in the worst of the storm, the Mason rolled 70 degrees to port far beyond the design safety margin. Water poured over the deck. Equipment broke loose. For several seconds, the ship hung at an impossible angle, and every man aboard thought she would capsize. Then somehow she rolled back, but the punishment had been too much. When the angle decreased and men could move around again, damage reports started coming in. The deck had split. The seam running along the center of the ship, where two halves of the hull met, had fractured from the stress. In one compartment, 2 support beams had collapsed. The radio antenna had been torn away by the wind leaving the ship, unable to communicate. Water was flooding into spaces below deck. The Mason was in danger of breaking apart. Most ships facing this level of damage in these conditions would have immediately headed for the nearest port. The convoy commodore would have understood. British escorts could take over. Self-preservation is not cowardice, it is common sense. But Lieutenant Commander Blackford and his crew made a different choice. They decided to repair the ship at sea and complete the mission. What followed was one of the most remarkable displays of damage control seamanship in World War II. Working in conditions that made standing upright nearly impossible, the crew fabricated repairs using whatever materials were available. They shored up the collapsed beams with timbers. They welded steel plates over the deck fracture from the inside, knowing that if the weld failed, the ship would flood and sink. They pumped water from compartments faster than the sea could pour in. They rigged a new antenna so they could restore communications. All of this was done while the storm continued to rage, while waves swept the deck, while the ship rolled and pitched so violently that tools and materials had to be lashed down to keep them from becoming projectiles. It took hours. Men worked until they were exhausted, then kept working. When compartments flooded, they bailed them out and kept working. When tools were lost overboard, they improvised with others. 2 hours after the damage was first reported, the Mason's deck was repaired well enough to continue operations. The antenna was functional, the engine room was clear, the ship was battered but operational, and then they went back. Having successfully escorted the faster ships of the convoy to a position where British escorts could take over the Mason, turned around and headed back into the storm to collect the stragglers and the slower vessels still struggling in the open ocean. British destroyers, seeing what the Mason was doing and judging the conditions too dangerous, turned back to port. The Mason pressed on. For 3 more days, she remained at sea in the storm, locating ships that had fallen behind, guiding them back into formation, protecting them from potential submarine attack, and shepherding them towards safety. By the time convoy NY's 1-19 finally reached British waters, 12 additional ships had been brought in safely because the Mason refused to abandon them. Convoy Commodore Alfred Lind, who had overall responsibility for NY 1119, was astonished by what he witnessed. He called the Mason the plucky Mason in his official report and immediately recommended that the entire crew receive a letter of commendation for meritorious service. This was a significant honor rarely given, and it acknowledged that the crew had performed far beyond normal duty requirements. Lieutenant Commander Blackford endorsed the recommendation and forwarded it through proper channels. The crew, exhausted but proud, believed their actions had finally proved what they had been trying to prove all along, that they were as capable as any sailors in the Navy, regardless of race. They returned to New York in late November 1944, expecting recognition and perhaps some acknowledgement that the Mason experiment had succeeded beyond all expectations. What they received was silence. The Navy never acted on Commodore Lynn's recommendation. No letters of commendation were issued. No official recognition was given. The Mason's extraordinary performance in convoy NY-119 was not mentioned in press releases, not highlighted in Navy publications, not used as an example of successful operations. It was as if it had never happened. The reasons for this silence are not difficult to discern. By late 1944, the Navy's leadership had invested considerable institutional prestige in the argument that racial integration would harm combat effectiveness. The success of the Mason directly contradicted this position. If a predominantly black crew could perform as well or better than white crews under the most challenging conditions imaginable, then the justification for segregation collapsed. Rather than acknowledge this publicly, Navy leadership chose simply to ignore it. The Mason's war record was not erased. The ship's logs and official reports documented everything, but it was not celebrated or widely known. To the crew, this felt like a deliberate insult. "We knew why they wouldn't give us the commendation," Charles Divers said years later. "We had embarrassed them by succeeding. They couldn't eat crow, so they pretended it didn't happen." The USS Mason continued escort duty for the remainder of the war. She joined Task Force 64 in December 1944 and sailed to the Mediterranean, escorting convoys to North Africa. On January 11, 1945, while off the coast of Algeria, the Mason made radar contact with what appeared to be a surface submarine. The crew went to battle stations. Blackford ordered full speed and prepared to attack. The Mason closed on the target, dropped depth charges, and attempted to ram what they believed was a German U-boat. When they circled back to the impact point and illuminated the area with searchlights, they discovered their target was a wooden derelict, an abandoned vessel approximately 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, probably a piece of harbour infrastructure that had broken loose. It was embarrassing, but not particularly unusual. Submarine detection was imprecise, and false contacts were common. The Mason returned to convoy duty without incident. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Mason was at sea 2 days out of Oran, en route to the United States East Coast. The war in Europe was over. The ship returned to New York later that month and spent the summer conducting training operations along the coast. From late July through mid-August, she served as a school ship for the Naval Training Center in Miami, helping train new sailors. In August and September, she participated in underwater signal testing operations near Bermuda. On September through 10, 1945, the Mason arrived in Charleston. On October 12, 1945, she was decommissioned. On November 1st, she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register. On March 18, 1947, the ship was sold for scrap and delivered to a facility in New Jersey, where she was broken up. The USS Mason had served for just 18 months. She had escorted 6 convoys across the Atlantic. She had not sunk any U-boats or engaged in dramatic surface actions. By conventional measures of combat effectiveness, her record was unremarkable. Dozens of destroyer escorts compiled similar records during the war. But the Mason was never about conventional measures. She was about proving that black sailors could do the work under any conditions, as well as anyone else. And that is precisely what her crew demonstrated. By the time the Mason was decommissioned, all of the ship's chief petty officers, the senior enlisted leadership, were black men who had risen through the ranks on merit and performance. This was unprecedented in the Navy. The men who served on the Mason went on to have varied post-war lives. Some remained in the Navy and helped integrate the service after President Truman ordered full desegregation in 1948. Others returned to civilian life and pursued careers in fields that had been closed to them before the war. A few continued in maritime professions, becoming merchant sailors or joining the Coast Guard. All of them carried the knowledge that they had helped change history, even if history was slow to acknowledge it. For decades, the story of the USS Mason remained largely unknown outside the community of veterans who had served aboard her. The Navy did not feature the ship in official histories. Textbooks on World War II did not mention her. The thousands of books written about the Atlantic Convoy War rarely included even a footnote about the Mason. This began to change in the 1980s and 1990s, as historians and journalists started documenting African American contributions to the war effort. James Graham, who had served as a radio man on the Mason, became particularly concerned that the ship's story would be lost. "I feared that this attitude would erase all historical memory of the USS Mason," he said in an interview years later. Graham and other veterans worked to collect documents, photographs, and oral histories. They formed the USS Mason Association to preserve the ship's legacy and educate the public. In 1994, 50 years after convoy NY-119, the recognition that had been denied finally arrived. Congressman Charles Rangel of New York, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and himself, a Korean War veteran, learned about the Mason and the denied letter of commendation. He began advocating for official recognition of the crew's service. On March 23, 1994, President Bill Clinton hosted a ceremony at the White House, honoring the veterans of the USS Mason. Secretary of the Navy, John Dalton, presented letters of commendation to the surviving crew members, acknowledging their service in convoy NY-119 and stating that they had upheld the highest traditions of U.S. naval service. It had taken 50 years, but the Navy had finally admitted what should have been acknowledged in 1944. The ceremony was attended by several dozen surviving crew members, most now in their 70s. Also present was Mansell Blackford, the son of Captain William Blackford, who had commanded the ship. In speeches and interviews, the veterans spoke not with bitterness but with pride. They had served their country. They had performed their duty. They had proved what they set out to prove. The delay in recognition was unfortunate, but it did not diminish what they had accomplished. The legacy of the USS Mason extends beyond the ship herself. In April 2003, the United States Navy commissioned USS Mason DDG-87, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. This modern warship was named not after Ensign Newton Henry Mason, but after the crew of the World War II destroyer Escort. The ship's motto is, "Proudly We Serve," a direct reference to the title of a documentary film about the original Mason. DDG-87 carries the same whole number sequence as DE-529 and displays a square detail code in honor of her predecessor. The modern Mason has deployed to the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea, participating in operations from counter-piracy to ballistic missile defense. Her crew is integrated, drawn from all ethnic backgrounds, serving together without the segregation that defined the Navy of 1944. That integration is the direct result of what the crew of DE-529 proved possible. The story of the USS Mason matters because it illustrates a truth about American history that is often uncomfortable to acknowledge, that racial progress has rarely been freely given and has almost always required extraordinary effort and sacrifice from those fighting for equality. The men who served on the Mason did not choose to be symbols or to carry the burden of representing their entire race. They simply wanted to serve their country as sailors. They were forced into the role of pioneers because the Navy and the nation refused to accept them as equals. And having been placed in that impossible position where every action was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every success minimized, they rose to the challenge. They operated their ship with skill and courage. They saved lives. They completed every mission assigned to them. And when the decks split and the storm raged and the ocean tried to kill them, they repaired their ship and went back to finish the job. not because they were superhuman, but because they were determined to prove their humanity in the face of a system that questioned it. In 2004, the film Proud dramatized the story of the USS Mason for a new generation. The documentary, Proudly We Served, narrated by Ossie Davis, had brought the story to wider attention in the 1990s. Books including Mary Pat Kelly's detailed history of the ship and crew documented the Mason's service for posterity. Schools began including the Mason in curriculum about World War II and the Civil Rights Movement. Museums, including the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, created exhibits about the ship and her crew. Slowly, the forgotten story was being remembered. Yet even now, most Americans have never heard of the USS Mason. She does not appear in popular histories of the war with the frequency of ships like the USS Enterprise or USS Indianapolis. Her story is not taught in schools as widely as the Tuskegee Airmen or the Buffalo Soldiers. This is partly because naval history is generally less accessible to public imagination than aviation or ground combat. But it is also because acknowledging the Mason's story requires acknowledging an uncomfortable truth that the United States fought World War II with a segregated military, that black servicemen were systematically denied opportunities and recognition, and that when they were finally given a chance to prove themselves, they had to be twice as good to receive half as much credit. The crew of the USS Mason understood this reality intimately. They lived it every day, and their response was not to give up or to accept the limitations placed upon them, but to exceed every expectation, to perform so well that denial became impossible. When the storm of the century hit convoy NY-119 and the deck split, and the choices were to seek safety or risk their lives to save others, they chose to stay. That choice was not merely about professional duty or military discipline. It was about proving yet again that they belonged, that they were worthy. That skin color had nothing to do with courage, competence, or character. They proved it, though. The Navy of 1944 refused to acknowledge it. They proved it, though. Their service was forgotten for 50 years. They proved it, and that proof eventually helped change the institution that had doubted them. The United States Navy, today, is integrated, meritocratic, and professional. African Americans serve at every rank in every specialty on every type of ship. That progress did not happen automatically. It happened because men like the crew of the USS Mason demonstrated repeatedly and undeniably that segregation was not merely unjust. It was a waste of human potential that the Navy could not afford. On October 18th each year, the modern USS Mason DDG-87 commemorates the service of her predecessor's crew during convoy NY-119. Officers and sailors gather to remember the men who sailed through the storm, repaired their ship at sea, and refused to abandon the vessels depending on them for protection. Most of the original crew have now passed away. Charles Divers, James Graham, Gordon, Grant, James Dufault, and dozens of others have gone. Their average age would now be well over 100. Soon, there will be no living witnesses to what happened in the North Atlantic in October 1944. But the story remains preserved in documents, photographs, oral histories, and institutional memory. It remains as a reminder that courage comes in many forms, that heroism is often found in the determination to do ordinary work extraordinarily well, and that the fight for equality requires not only moral clarity, but also relentless performance in the face of relentless scrutiny. The crew of the USS Mason fought that fight, and they won it, though victory took 50 years to acknowledge. They were called Eleanor's Folly, an experiment expected to fail. They became proof that the Navy's segregation policy was built on prejudice rather than reality. They were sailors who happened to be black in an era when the Navy believed those two identities were incompatible. They proved otherwise not with speeches or protests, but by doing their jobs so well that even deliberate silence could not erase what they accomplished. That is their legacy, and it is one worth remembering.